"I haven't eaten in days," Teen told Mountain Widow. She fed him, and later became his wife. The gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder, but Eleanor McKenna barely flinched as she continued hanging laundry on the weathered rope line behind her cabin. Living alone in the Colorado Territory Mountains for 3 years had taught her to distinguish between gunshots that mattered and those that did not. This one came from too far down the valley to concern her. What did concern her was the thin column of smoke rising from behind the pine grove near Willow Creek. Smoke meant people, and people this far up the mountain usually meant trouble. She set down her laundry basket and walked to the cabin's edge, shading her eyes against the harsh afternoon sun. The September air carried the scent of pine needles and the distant promise of snow. Eleanor had built her life around solitude after losing everything that mattered. Her husband Thomas had died in a mining accident. Her 2 sons had succumbed to scarlet fever the following winter, and creditors had claimed their ranch in Denver. At 38, she had packed what remained of her possessions into a wagon and driven into these mountains, seeking nothing more than isolation and the chance to exist, without constant reminders of what she had lost. The smoke continued rising, steady and controlled like a campfire rather than a wildfire. Eleanor retrieved her husband's old Winchester rifle from inside the cabin and began making her way down the rocky slope toward the creek. Her boots found familiar footholds between the granite outcroppings, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned every trail and hiding spot within 5 miles of her home. As she drew closer to the source of the smoke, she heard voices carrying on the thin mountain air. 2 men speaking in low tones that suggested they did not want to be overheard. Eleanor crept to within 50 yards of their camp and positioned herself behind a massive boulder that provided clear sight lines while keeping her hidden. The first man was older, perhaps 50, with a grizzled beard and clothes that marked him as someone who lived rough. His companion appeared much younger, barely more than a boy despite his height. Both wore gun belts, but their horses looked tired, and their supplies appeared minimal. They were eating beans from a shared pot over a small fire, and their conversation carried the tension of men who had been riding hard. "We need to keep moving," the older man said between spoonfuls. "They will not give up the chase easily. My horse cannot take much more," the younger one replied. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his age. "Neither can I, if we are being honest about it." Eleanor watched them for another 10 minutes, trying to assess the threat they might represent. The older man kept glancing toward the trail they had taken up the mountain, clearly worried about pursuit. The younger one appeared exhausted, slumping forward as he ate. Neither seemed to notice her presence. She was preparing to retreat back to her cabin when the sound of approaching horses echoed from lower in the valley. Both men around the campfire tensed immediately, the older one reaching for his weapon while the younger scrambled to douse the fire with dirt. "Too late for that," the older man whispered harshly. "They have already seen the smoke." Through the trees below, Eleanor could make out a group of riders making their way up the valley. From this distance, she counted at least 6 men, possibly more. They rode with purpose, following the same trail the 2 men at the campfire had used. The older man grabbed his companion by the shoulder. "Listen to me carefully. When they get close enough, I want you to take your horse and ride north toward the ridge. Do not stop, do not look back, and do not try to help me. I will not leave you to face them alone. You will do exactly as I tell you. This whole mess started because of me, and I will not have your death on my conscience as well." Eleanor found herself studying the younger man more carefully. Despite his height and the gun at his hip, something about his posture and the way he deferred to his companion suggested he was little more than a boy playing at being a man. His clothes, while dusty from travel, appeared to be of better quality than those of his companion. His horse, though tired, was clearly a fine animal, worth more than most men in this territory earned in a year. The approaching riders were now close enough for Eleanor to hear individual voices, though she could not make out specific words. The 2 men by the dead campfire were gathering their belongings with desperate haste, but it was clear they would not have time to escape before being discovered. Eleanor made a decision that surprised her. Moving quickly but quietly, she worked her way around the boulder and approached the 2 men from behind. When she was close enough to speak without raising her voice, she cleared her throat softly. Both men spun toward her, hands moving toward their weapons before they registered that she was a woman alone and apparently unarmed. The older man kept his hand near his gun anyway, but the younger one simply stared at her with wide eyes. "There is a cave about 200 yards upstream," Eleanor said quietly. Large enough for your horses if you lead them carefully. The entrance is hidden by fallen rocks, but if you follow the creek and look for a dead pine with 3 trunks, you will find it. The older man studied her suspiciously. Why would you help us? Because 6 men chasing 2 usually means the 2 are in the right. Eleanor glanced toward the approaching sound of horses. You have perhaps 3 minutes before they reach this spot. The younger man stepped forward. Thank you. We will not forget this kindness. Up close, Eleanor could see that he was indeed very young, probably no more than 18 or 19. His face showed the kind of exhaustion that comes from days without proper rest, and his clothes, while well made, hung loose on his frame as if he had lost weight recently. Go, she said simply, then melted back into the trees without waiting to see if they followed her advice. Eleanor made her way to a different vantage point where she could observe both the abandoned campsite and the direction the 2 men had taken. Within minutes, the pursuing riders arrived at the spot where the fire had been. Their leader, a hard-faced man with a badge pinned to his vest, dismounted and began examining the ground. Fire is still warm, he called to his companions. They cannot be far ahead. The men spread out, searching for tracks and signs of which direction their quarry had taken. Eleanor watched as they found the obvious trail leading toward the cave she had directed the fugitives to, but after following it for a short distance, they seemed to lose the track where it entered the rocky streambed. After an hour of searching, the posse gathered again at the campsite. Their leader appeared frustrated, frequently removing his hat to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air. We will make camp here tonight, he announced. They cannot have gone far on foot, and their horses will need water. We will find them in the morning. Eleanor remained hidden until darkness fell and the posse had settled in for the night. Then she carefully made her way back toward her cabin, taking a circuitous route that avoided both the camp and the cave, where she hoped the 2 fugitives had found shelter. She spent a restless night wondering what she had gotten herself involved in, and whether she had made a terrible mistake. The sensible thing would be to stay out of whatever trouble those men had brought to her mountain. She had come here specifically to avoid the complications and dangers that came with other people's problems. But when morning came, Eleanor found herself packing supplies into a canvas bag: dried meat, hardtack, coffee, and a bottle of whiskey that had been gathering dust in her cupboard since Thomas died. She told herself she was simply checking to make sure the men had moved on and were no longer a threat to her peace. She certainly was not planning to help them further. The posse was already breaking camp when Eleanor reached a position where she could observe them. They spent another 2 hours searching the immediate area before finally mounting up and continuing north along the main trail. Eleanor waited until they were completely out of sight before making her way to the cave. She found the entrance exactly as she remembered it, concealed behind a jumble of granite boulders that had fallen from the cliff face years earlier. The opening was narrow, requiring her to turn sideways to squeeze through, but it opened into a substantial cavern beyond. Both men were there, along with their horses. The older man had his gun drawn before Eleanor was fully inside the cave, but he lowered it when he recognized her. I brought supplies, Eleanor said, setting down the canvas bag. The men chasing you have moved on, but they will likely be back. The younger man stepped forward eagerly. We are grateful for your help, truly. I am James Harrison, and this is my uncle Samuel. Samuel Harrison studied Eleanor with sharp eyes. Why are you helping us? You do not know anything about our situation. You are right. I do not know anything about your situation, and I do not particularly want to. Eleanor began removing items from the bag. But I know what it looks like when someone is running for their life, and I know that Posse will be back with more men and dogs. James accepted the food she offered with obvious hunger, tearing into the dried meat immediately. He was thinner than Eleanor had initially realized, and she suspected he had been eating poorly for some time. How long since you have had a proper meal? She asked. 3 days, James replied between bites. Maybe 4. We have been moving too fast to hunt, and our supplies ran out near Leadville. Samuel continued watching Eleanor suspiciously. You should not get involved in this. These men are not ordinary lawmen, and they will not give up easily. Then perhaps you should tell me what this is about so I can decide how much danger I'm putting myself in. Samuel and James exchanged glances. Finally, Samuel sighed and holstered his weapon completely. James is the son of my brother William. William owned a ranch outside Colorado Springs, built it up from nothing over 20 years. Last spring, a man named Marcus Dalton started making offers to buy the land. When William refused, strange things began happening. Cattle disappeared, water sources were poisoned, and finally the ranch house burned down with William and his wife inside. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air in the cave. They were murdered? No way to prove it, but yes. Dalton had connections with the territorial government and the local sheriff. Within a week of the funeral, he produced documents claiming William owed him money and had signed over the ranch as collateral. The papers were fake, but they carried official seals and signatures. James looked up from his food. I tried to contest it through the courts, but Dalton had judges in his pocket too. When I started asking too many questions and gathering evidence, men came to arrest me on charges of disturbing the peace and threatening public officials. So you ran. Samuel helped me escape, and we have been trying to reach Denver, where I have contacts who might be able to help expose what Dalton has done. But his men have been hunting us for 2 weeks. Eleanor absorbed this information while watching James eat. Despite his obvious hunger, he ate slowly and carefully, suggesting he had been taught proper manners. His speech patterns and vocabulary supported Samuel's claim that he came from a family of some means. You said they were not ordinary lawmen, Eleanor said to Samuel. Dalton hired them privately, but they carry territorial badges. Some of them are legitimate peace officers, others are just gun hands with official backing. The leader, Morrison, has a reputation for bringing in fugitives one way or another. Eleanor considered this. She had heard of Marcus Dalton, though only in passing. Men like him were becoming common in the territory as railroads and mining interests brought new money and new corruption to Colorado. What will you do if you reach Denver? James wiped his hands on his pants. My father had friends there, businessmen and lawyers who knew him before he moved to Colorado Springs. They will know the truth about his character and his finances. With their help, I might be able to prove the documents are fraudulent. Might. It is the only chance I have. Dalton has taken everything else. Eleanor found herself studying the young man's face as he spoke. There was determination there, but also a kind of innocence that suggested he still believed the world operated according to rules of fairness and justice. She wondered how long that innocence would survive. You cannot stay here, she said finally. This cave is known to local hunters, and when Morrison returns with more men, they will find it eventually. Samuel nodded grimly. We plan to move tonight. Travel by darkness until we clear the immediate area. Your horses are exhausted, and winter weather is coming early this year. You will not make it to Denver in your current condition. Eleanor surprised herself by continuing. There is another option. My cabin is isolated and I have enough supplies to support 2 additional people for several weeks. You could rest, regain your strength, and plan your next move carefully. Both men stared at her. Samuel was the first to respond. That is generous, but we cannot ask you to take such a risk. If Morrison discovers you helped us, he will not hesitate to arrest you as an accomplice. I am not asking for your permission. I am making an offer. You can accept it or not. James looked between his uncle and Eleanor. Why would you do this for strangers? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. The truth was complicated and personal, involving feelings she had buried along with her family. But there was something about this young man that reminded her of her oldest son, David, who would have been about James's age if he had lived. Because sometimes helping others is the only way to help yourself, she said finally. That evening, Eleanor led them through a maze of game trails and rocky passages to her cabin. The route took nearly 3 hours to cover what should have been a 1-hour journey, but it avoided all the obvious paths and left minimal sign of their passage. Her cabin sat in a natural bowl surrounded by towering pine trees, with a clear stream running nearby and excellent sightlines in all directions. Thomas had chosen the location well, she realized, though he had been thinking more about hunting and fishing than defense. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. One large room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A smaller room in the back contained Eleanor's bed and personal belongings. The furnishings were well made but sparse, giving the impression of a life stripped down to essentials. James and Samuel would sleep in the main room using blankets Eleanor provided. The arrangement was not ideal, but it was infinitely better than the cave or sleeping rough in the mountains with winter approaching. Over the next few days, Eleanor observed her guests carefully. Samuel remained watchful and suspicious, clearly uncomfortable with accepting help from someone he did not know. He spent his time cleaning weapons, studying maps, and planning routes to Denver. James, on the other hand, seemed to relax slightly as he recovered from the exhaustion of their flight. Eleanor found herself drawn into conversations with James about his life before the tragedy that had brought him to her mountain. He spoke of his parents with obvious love and respect, describing a childhood spent learning to manage the ranch and handle livestock. His education had been limited but practical, focused on the skills needed to build and maintain a successful operation in challenging country. "My father always said the land would provide for us if we treated it right," James said one evening as they sat around the fireplace. He believed in working with the country instead of fighting against it. Eleanor nodded, understanding the philosophy. It sounds like he was a wise man. He was. That is why what Dalton did makes no sense. My father never borrowed money he could not repay, and he certainly never signed papers putting the ranch at risk. But proving that seems impossible when the system is corrupted. Samuel looked up from the map he was studying. The system is not corrupted everywhere. Denver has federal connections, and federal judges who cannot be bought as easily as territorial ones. "You hope," Eleanor said quietly. "It is the only hope we have." Eleanor found herself increasingly invested in their success, though she tried to maintain emotional distance. She had learned to protect herself from caring too much about outcomes beyond her control. But James's situation awakened protective instincts she thought she had buried. On the fourth day, James offered to help with chores around the cabin. Eleanor initially refused, but he persisted with polite determination until she relented. She set him to work splitting firewood, a task that would keep him busy and help rebuild his strength. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as James worked. Despite his youth and recent hardships, he handled the axe with skill and efficiency. His movements showed the kind of coordination that came from years of physical labor, and he approached the task with methodical patience rather than rushing to finish quickly. When he paused to rest, Eleanor brought him water and watched him drink gratefully. Up close, she could see that he was beginning to recover from the exhaustion and fear that had marked his appearance when they first met. Regular meals and adequate sleep were restoring both his physical condition and his emotional equilibrium. "You are stronger than you looked when you first arrived," Eleanor observed. James wiped sweat from his forehead. "I feel more like myself again. Thank you for giving us this chance to recover. What will you do if you cannot prove your case in Denver?" James was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I have not allowed myself to think about that possibility. If I cannot clear my family's name and reclaim our land legally, then I am not sure what kind of future I can build." Eleanor heard something in his voice that concerned her. "You would not try to take justice into your own hands." "My uncle thinks about it. I can see it in his eyes when he thinks I am not watching. But that path leads nowhere good." "No, it does not." James resumed splitting wood, his movements perhaps a bit more forceful than before. Eleanor remained nearby, ostensibly hanging laundry but actually continuing to observe him. She was beginning to recognize signs of the internal struggle he was facing between hope and despair, between faith in legal justice and the temptation of more direct action. That evening, Samuel announced that he believed they had recovered sufficiently to continue their journey to Denver. The weather was holding, their horses were rested, and every day they remained in one place increased the risk of discovery. Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of disappointment at the news, though she tried not to show it. The presence of other people in her cabin had gradually become less intrusive and more companionable than she had anticipated. The isolation she had sought so deliberately was beginning to feel less like protection and more like imprisonment. "When will you leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow night, if the weather holds. We will travel the first part of the journey in darkness to avoid being seen." James looked up from the book he was reading, one of the few volumes Eleanor had brought to the cabin. "I wish there was some way to repay your kindness. Succeeding in Denver will be repayment enough." Samuel studied Eleanor's face carefully. "You could come with us." The suggestion surprised everyone, including Samuel himself. Eleanor could see him reconsidering the wisdom of the offer even as he made it. "I have no business in Denver," Eleanor replied. "You have no business staying alone on this mountain through another winter either," Samuel continued. "What happens if you get sick or injured with no one to help?" Eleanor had wondered the same thing herself, though she tried not to dwell on such possibilities. The previous winter had been difficult enough with adequate supplies and good health. Each year would likely be harder than the last. "I came here for solitude. That has not changed." James closed his book and looked at her directly. "But solitude and isolation are not the same thing. You could have a life in Denver, friends, a community." I had a community once, I lost it. Eleanor's response ended the conversation, but it did not end her internal debate. That night, she lay awake considering possibilities she had not allowed herself to contemplate in years. What would it mean to return to civilization? To take up the burden of caring about other people's lives and problems again? The next morning brought heavy clouds and the smell of snow in the air. Samuel studied the sky with obvious concern, recognizing that winter weather would make their journey significantly more dangerous. We should leave today, he told James. Waiting for nightfall might mean traveling in a blizzard. Eleanor agreed with his assessment. The signs all pointed to a major storm system moving into the area, possibly the first serious snow of the season. Travel would become difficult or impossible within hours. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor found herself making another impulsive decision. She gathered her most important possessions into a single bag: photographs of her family, Thomas's watch, her mother's wedding ring, and the deed to property she still owned in Denver. "I have changed my mind," she announced. "If you are willing to have me, I will travel with you to Denver." Samuel and James stared at her in surprise. Samuel recovered first. "What changed your mind?" Eleanor looked around the cabin that had been her refuge for 3 years. "Perhaps I have been hiding long enough." The snow began falling as they saddled their horses and prepared to leave. Eleanor took one last look at the cabin before mounting up, wondering if she would ever see it again. The structure would likely survive the winter, but whether she would have reason to return was another question entirely. They rode out into the swirling snow with Samuel leading, Eleanor in the middle, and James bringing up the rear. The trail down from the mountain was treacherous under the best conditions, and the snow made it significantly more dangerous. Eleanor found herself thinking about the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. A chance encounter with 2 strangers had somehow evolved into a decision that would reshape her entire future. She was not sure whether to attribute it to fate, impulse, or simple loneliness, finally overcoming her determination to remain isolated. As they descended through the pine forest, the snow continued to intensify. Within an hour, visibility was reduced to just a few yards, and the horses were struggling to find secure footing on the increasingly slippery trail. Samuel called a halt at a relatively sheltered spot among a cluster of large boulders. "We need to reconsider this," he shouted over the wind. "The storm is worse than I anticipated." Eleanor wiped snow from her face and assessed their situation. They were perhaps 2 hours down from her cabin, but still deep in the mountains. The trail ahead would only become more exposed and dangerous as they descended. "There is an old mining cabin about a mile south of here," she called back. "It might provide shelter until the storm passes." Samuel nodded and urged his horse in the direction Eleanor indicated. The next hour was a nightmare of navigation through blinding snow and increasingly difficult terrain. Eleanor began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake in leaving the security of her own cabin. But eventually, the dark shape of the mining cabin emerged from the storm. The structure was small and primitive, built hastily by prospectors who had long since moved on or died. But it had 4 walls and a roof, which made it paradise under the circumstances. They managed to get the horses into a lean-to shelter attached to the cabin and themselves into the main room, just as the storm reached its full intensity. Eleanor had experienced many mountain blizzards, but this one promised to be among the worst. The cabin contained basic furnishings left by its previous occupants: a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and sleeping platforms built against 2 walls. There was even a small supply of firewood, dry enough to burn despite the cabin's long abandonment. As they settled in to wait out the storm, Eleanor found herself in closer quarters with her companions than she had been since their arrival at her cabin. The forced intimacy of their shared shelter gradually broke down some of the remaining barriers between them. James, in particular, seemed to relax his guard as the evening progressed. Perhaps it was relief at finding adequate shelter, or perhaps it was the growing sense that they had successfully escaped immediate pursuit. Whatever the reason, he began sharing stories of his childhood and his dreams for the future. "I always planned to expand the ranch," he said, as they sat around the fire. "My father built something good, but it could have been so much more. We had the land and the water rights to support twice as many cattle." Eleanor listened to his plans with mixed emotions. His enthusiasm was infectious, but she knew the reality of what he faced in Denver. Even if he succeeded in proving his case, reclaiming stolen property would be a long and expensive process. The chances of him ever returning to the life he described were minimal. Samuel seemed to understand this as well. Though he maintained an outward optimism for his nephew's sake, Eleanor caught him watching James with the kind of protective sadness that comes from loving someone whose dreams are likely to be crushed by circumstances beyond their control. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. By the time it finally cleared, nearly 2 feet of snow had fallen, making immediate travel impossible. They would need to wait at least another day for conditions to improve. Eleanor used the delay to study her companions more carefully. Samuel, she realized, was more complex than she had initially assumed. His rough appearance and suspicious nature masked a sharp intelligence and genuine affection for his nephew. James, meanwhile, was beginning to show signs of the man he might become if he survived the challenges ahead. On their 3rd day in the mining cabin, James made an observation that surprised Eleanor. "You are different here than you were at your cabin," he said as they shared the morning meal. "How so?" "Less guarded. More like someone who used to be comfortable around people." Eleanor considered this. Perhaps isolation changes people in ways they do not expect. "My mother always said that people were meant to live in community. She thought hermits were either saints or madmen, and most were madmen." "What did your father think?" James smiled slightly. "He said my mother was probably right, but that some people needed to be alone for a while before they could be around others again." Eleanor found herself thinking about Thomas and how he might have viewed her decision to retreat to the mountains. He had been a practical man who understood that grief sometimes required extreme measures, but he also believed in facing problems directly rather than running from them. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," she said. "He was. I hope I can live up to his example." That afternoon, the weather cleared enough for them to attempt the next stage of their journey. The snow made travel slower and more difficult, but the trail was passable for experienced riders on strong horses. As they rode, Eleanor found herself thinking about Denver and what awaited them there. She had not been in the city for over 3 years, and it would have changed significantly in that time. The Colorado Territory was experiencing rapid growth, driven by mining discoveries and railroad construction. Denver itself was evolving from a rough frontier town into something approaching a real city. Eleanor owned a small house in Denver, inherited from her parents, and rented out through a property management company. The income from that rental had helped sustain her during her years in the mountains. She wondered what condition the house might be in, and whether it would be suitable for temporary residence. More importantly, she wondered whether she would be able to readjust to city life after 3 years of solitude. The sounds, the crowds, the constant activity of urban living might prove overwhelming after the peace of her mountain retreat. James seemed to share some of her concerns, though his were more focused on the legal challenges ahead. "What if the people my father knew in Denver have moved on or died?" he asked as they made camp that evening. "What if no one remembers him or cares about what happened to our family?" Samuel poked at the fire with a stick. "Then we will find other ways to prove our case. Court records, bank documents, witness testimony. The truth has a way of surfacing if you know where to look." Eleanor hoped Samuel was right, but she had seen enough of the world to know that truth and justice did not always align. Men like Marcus Dalton succeeded precisely because they understood how to manipulate systems that were supposed to protect honest people. Their second night on the trail passed without incident, though Eleanor remained alert for signs of pursuit. The snow would have made tracking more difficult, but it would also have made their own passage more visible to anyone who knew what to look for. On the 3rd day, they encountered their first other travelers since leaving Eleanor's cabin. A freight wagon loaded with supplies was making its way up the mountain toward mining camps in the high country. The driver, a weathered man in his 50s, greeted them cordially, but studied their faces carefully. Eleanor engaged him in conversation about trail conditions and weather, while Samuel and James remained in the background. After several minutes of discussion, the driver seemed satisfied that they were simply travelers rather than fugitives, and he continued on his way. "Do you think he will remember us?" James asked after the wagon was out of sight. Samuel shrugged. "If Morrison's men question him, probably, but they would have to find him first, and he is heading into country where they are unlikely to follow." Eleanor was less optimistic. The driver had seemed friendly enough, but frontier people survived by being observant and cautious. If there was a reward for information about James and Samuel, word would spread quickly through the informal network of traders, prospectors, and travelers who moved through the territory. As they descended from the high mountains into the foothills, the character of the country began to change. The dense pine forests gave way to more open terrain, dotted with aspen groves and meadows. The snow was less deep here, and travel became correspondingly easier. Eleanor felt a growing sense of anticipation as they approached the edge of civilization. Part of her was eager to rejoin the human community she had abandoned, but another part mourned the loss of the simplicity and peace she was leaving behind. On their fourth day of travel, they crested a ridge and saw Denver spread out in the valley below. The city had grown significantly since Eleanor's last visit, with new buildings and neighborhoods extending far beyond the original settlement. Smoke from hundreds of chimneys created a haze that hung over the entire area, and even from a distance they could hear the sounds of construction and commerce. James stared at the scene for a long time without speaking. Eleanor wondered what he was thinking, whether the sight of their destination filled him with hope or apprehension. "It is larger than I expected," he said finally. Samuel nodded. "More people means more opportunities, but also more complications. We will need to be careful about who we trust." Eleanor agreed. In a small community, strangers were noticed immediately. In a city the size of Denver, they could blend in more easily, but they would also have more difficulty identifying potential threats. They spent that night camped in the foothills outside the city, making final preparations for their entry into Denver. Eleanor retrieved her parents' house key from her belongings and shared what she remembered about the property and its location. "The house is small but adequate," she told them. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room. "The rent I have been collecting suggests it is in reasonable condition, though I cannot guarantee anything." James seemed grateful for any shelter that did not involve sleeping on the ground or in abandoned buildings. Samuel was more concerned with the strategic advantages and disadvantages of their chosen location. "Is it in a neighborhood where strangers are noticed?" he asked. Eleanor tried to remember the character of the area from her last visit. "It is a middle-class neighborhood, respectable but not wealthy. People mind their own business for the most part." The next morning they rode into Denver as the city was waking up. The streets were already busy with merchants, laborers, and early morning travelers. Eleanor was struck by how much noise and activity surrounded them after months of mountain silence. Eleanor's house was located on a tree-lined street several blocks from the main commercial district. The neighborhood showed signs of recent growth, with new construction mixed among older established homes. Her own property appeared to be in good condition, with a small front yard and a stable in back that would accommodate their horses. Eleanor's key still worked, though the lock was stiff from disuse. Inside, the house was clean and modestly furnished, suggesting that her tenants had taken reasonable care of the property before moving out several months earlier. "It will serve our purposes well," Samuel said after inspecting the premises. "Good sightlines from the front windows, back exit through the kitchen, and the stable provide secure shelter for the horses." James seemed more interested in the simple comfort of having walls and a roof after days of camping. He immediately claimed one of the bedrooms and began unpacking his few possessions. Eleanor found herself standing in the middle of the sitting room, trying to reconcile her memories of this place with her current circumstances. She had lived here briefly after her parents' deaths, before marrying Thomas and moving to the ranch. The house held both happy memories and painful reminders of loss. Over the next few days, Eleanor helped James and Samuel establish contacts within Denver's legal and business communities. Her family name still carried some weight in the city, and she was able to arrange introductions with several prominent lawyers and businessmen who had known her father. The response to James's story was mixed. Some of the men Eleanor approached expressed sympathy, but seemed reluctant to get involved in what might become a contentious legal battle with territorial officials. Others showed more interest, particularly those who had their own concerns about corruption in the territorial government. Eleanor found herself becoming increasingly invested in the outcome of James's case. She had initially planned to help him get established in Denver, and then withdraw from active involvement, but as she learned more about the details of his family's tragedy, her sense of injustice grew stronger. Marcus Dalton, they discovered, had used similar tactics against other property owners throughout the Colorado Territory. James's case was not isolated but part of a larger pattern of land fraud and corruption. Several other families had lost property under suspicious circumstances, though none had tried to fight back through legal channels. "This is bigger than just your family's ranch," Eleanor told James one evening, as they reviewed documents one of the lawyers had provided. "Dalton has been systematically stealing land from people who cannot defend themselves." James studied the papers spread across the kitchen table. "Which means there might be other people willing to testify against him if they thought they had a chance of success." Samuel looked up from cleaning his rifle. It also means Dalton has more to lose and more reasons to ensure you never get your day in court. Eleanor understood the implication. The more they learned about the scope of Dalton's activities, the more dangerous their situation became. Men who built empires on fraud and corruption did not hesitate to use violence when legal maneuvering failed. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her childhood bedroom, thinking about the path that had brought her to this point. 6 months earlier, she had been a recluse living alone in the mountains, asking nothing from the world except to be left in peace. Now she was actively involved in a fight against corruption that could have far-reaching consequences for the entire territory. The transformation surprised her. She had thought her capacity for caring about other people's problems had died with her family, but James's situation had awakened something she thought was permanently buried. Whether that was good or dangerous remained to be seen. The next morning brought news that changed everything. One of the lawyers Eleanor had contacted sent word that Marcus Dowell,